Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1894 had settled over Baker Street like a grey shroud, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a realm of shadows and muffled sounds. I had spent the better part of the afternoon attending to correspondence at my desk, while my friend Sherlock Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa in an attitude of profound contemplation, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered sitting room, where newspapers lay scattered about the Persian rug, and the acrid smell of his strongest tobacco hung in the air like an unwelcome presence. It had been nearly a week since our last case, and I could sense that familiar restlessness beginning to overtake my companion. Holmes thrived upon the intellectual stimulation of complex problems, and the absence of such challenges invariably led to periods of brooding silence that I had learned not to interrupt. Yet on this particular evening, as I sealed the last of my letters and prepared to suggest we venture out for dinner, Holmes suddenly sat upright with that electric alertness that always preceded his most remarkable observations. "You have been writing to your publisher again, Watson," he remarked, without turning his gaze from the window, "and I perceive that your latest manuscript has been accepted, though not without certain editorial suggestions that have left you somewhat irritated. Furthermore, you stopped at Wigmore Street on your way home this afternoon, despite taking the longer route, which suggests you were avoiding someone, most likely Mrs. Pemberton from the second floor, who has been attempting to secure your medical opinion regarding her nephew's supposed nervous condition." Before I could express my amazement at these deductions, which were entirely accurate, a sharp knock echoed from the street door below. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in animated conversation with someone in the hallway, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs. Holmes rose with fluid grace and moved toward the fireplace, his entire demeanour transformed from languid contemplation to sharp attention. The door opened to admit a young woman in deep mourning dress, her black veil thrown back to reveal a face pale with distress and dark eyes that spoke of recent grief. She was perhaps 25 years of age, well-dressed, but not wealthy, and carried herself with the bearing of one accustomed to service in a respectable household. Holmes's penetrating gaze took in every detail of her appearance as she stood hesitating in the doorway, clearly struggling to find words for her extraordinary situation. "Pray be seated, miss," Holmes said gently, gesturing toward the chair beside the fire. "I perceive that you have recently suffered a bereavement, an employer, I believe, rather than a family member, and that you have travelled here from Kensington in considerable haste. The matter that brings you to Baker Street is one of such unusual nature that you have been reluctant to approach the regular police, fearing they would dismiss your concerns as the product of grief-stricken imagination." The young woman sank into the offered chair, her composure wavering. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling, "I am Miss Catherine Whitmore, and until 4 days ago I served as companion to Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke of Pembroke House in Kensington. She died on Sunday evening of what the physician termed heart failure, and I was present at her bedside when she drew her final breath. The funeral took place yesterday, and I thought my duties were at an end." She paused, reaching into her reticule with shaking hands to withdraw a cream-coloured envelope. "But this morning, Mr. Holmes, I received this letter through the post. It is written in Mrs. Pembroke's own hand, I would stake my life upon it, and it bears yesterday's postmark. The letter was mailed more than 12 hours after I watched her coffin lowered into the ground." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that particular intensity that indicated his complete absorption in a problem. He took the envelope delicately between his fingers, examining the postmark through his magnifying lens before carefully extracting the single sheet of paper within. His face grew grave as he read, and when he looked up, there was a quality in his expression that I had seldom seen, a mixture of fascination and something approaching unease. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you have brought me a most singular problem indeed. A correspondence from beyond the grave presents certain logical difficulties that even I find challenging." He turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye. "What do you make of it, Watson? Can the dead write letters?" "Certainly not," I replied firmly. "There must be some rational explanation." Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely my thoughts, which means, my dear fellow, that we are dealing with a very clever living person who wishes us to believe otherwise. Miss Whitmore, you have done well to come here. I believe your late employer may have more to tell us than she managed to convey in life." Holmes extended his hand toward the letter with the careful precision of a surgeon handling a delicate instrument. I observed that his grey eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity which invariably accompanied his encounters with the most perplexing of mysteries. He held the paper up to the lamplight, examining first the watermark, then the quality of the stationery, before finally settling back in his chair to read the contents with the methodical attention he reserved for the most crucial evidence. "Watson," he said at length, "pray read this aloud for Miss Whitmore's benefit as well as our own. I find that hearing the words spoken often reveals nuances that the eye alone might miss." I took the letter and adjusted my spectacles, noting immediately that the handwriting, while unmistakably feminine and educated, bore the slight tremor of either advanced age or extreme distress. The paper was of excellent quality, cream-coloured, and bearing the faint scent of lavender that spoke of a lady's personal correspondence. I cleared my throat and began to read the message that had apparently travelled from beyond the grave. "My dearest Catherine," I read aloud, "if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and I am no longer among the living. You must trust no one at Pembroke House, particularly my nephew Edmund, whose debts are far more extensive than he has admitted, and whose patience for his inheritance has grown dangerously thin. Beware the blue vial in the medicine cabinet, and remember that the truth lies where the shadow of the grandfather clock falls at noon. Most urgently, I hear them moving the heavy oak wardrobe in the hallway. The scraping sound is dreadful. I must hide this letter before they return. You have been like a daughter to me, Catherine. Seek the help of Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. He alone will see what others cannot. Your devoted friend, Adelaide Pembroke." The silence that followed my recitation was profound and unsettling. Miss Whitmore had grown even paler, if such a thing were possible, and her hands trembled as she pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Holmes, meanwhile, had sprung to his feet and was pacing the room with that restless energy that always accompanied his deepest concentration. "You perceive the central impossibility, Watson?" he asked, though his penetrating gaze remained fixed upon our client. The reference to the wardrobe being moved transforms this from a mere posthumous accusation into a logical paradox that demands explanation. Miss Whitmore nodded vigorously, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. "That is precisely what terrified me, Mr. Holmes. The oak wardrobe she mentions is an enormous piece of furniture that has stood in the same position in the hallway for over 20 years. It was only moved on Monday morning, the day after Mrs. Pembroke's death, to allow the undertakers sufficient space to carry the coffin down the narrow staircase. I supervised the moving myself, and it required 4 strong men to accomplish the task. The scraping sound it made across the wooden floor was indeed dreadful, just as she described. But she died peacefully on Sunday evening, Mr. Holmes. I was holding her hand when she drew her final breath." Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly and fixed Miss Whitmore with an intent stare. "You are absolutely certain of the timing? There can be no error in your recollection? None whatsoever, sir. Dr. Sterling pronounced her dead at precisely 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. The wardrobe was not moved until Monday morning at approximately 10 o'clock. It is impossible that she could have heard that sound while she lived. Impossible, Holmes murmured, returning to his chair. And yet here we have our own words describing it in vivid detail. This suggests either that Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke possessed prophetic powers, which I categorically reject, or that we are dealing with a deception of extraordinary sophistication. He turned his attention back to Miss Whitmore. Now then, I require a complete account of the household and the circumstances surrounding your employer's death. Begin with the nephew, Edmund Pembroke. Miss Whitmore composed herself with visible effort. Mr. Edmund Pembroke is Mrs. Pembroke's late husband's nephew, approximately 40 years of age and unmarried. He has resided at Pembroke House for the past 3 years, ostensibly to assist his aunt with her business affairs. However, I fear his primary motivation was financial. He maintains expensive habits, frequents the gaming establishments in St. James's, and has repeatedly pressed his aunt for advances on his inheritance. Their conversations on this subject had grown increasingly heated in recent weeks. And her will? What provisions had she made? The bulk of her considerable estate was to pass to Edmund, with modest annuities for the household staff and myself, and a smaller portion to her sister in the country. However, on the Friday before her death, she asked me to post a letter personally to a firm of solicitors in Lincoln's Inn Fields, Messrs. Blackwood and Hart. This struck me as unusual, as the family's legal affairs have always been handled by Mr. Reginald Cartwright of Cartwright and Sons. Holmes's eyebrows rose sharply. Indeed? A change of solicitors at such a time suggests she may have been contemplating alterations to her testamentary arrangements. What of her final illness? Describe the circumstances in precise detail. Mrs. Pembroke had been in declining health for several months, suffering from a weak heart condition. Her usual physician, Dr. Moore, had recently retired to the country, and she had begun consulting with Dr. Sterling, who came highly recommended by Mr. Edmund. On Sunday, she seemed in better spirits than usual. We took tea together in her sitting room, and she spoke optimistically of spring travels. At approximately 3 o'clock, she complained of chest pains and difficulty breathing. I summoned Dr. Sterling immediately, but by the time he arrived some 20 minutes later, she had passed away. 20 minutes is a considerable interval, Holmes observed. Where does Dr. Sterling maintain his practice? His surgery is on Gloucester Road, perhaps 10 minutes distant by carriage. I sent James, the footman, to fetch him at once. Holmes had begun his pacing once more, his long fingers steepled before him. The household staff provide me with their particulars. Mrs. Dalton serves as housekeeper and has been with the family for 15 years. James, the footman, has been in service for 8 years. Mary, the housemaid, joined us 2 years ago, and Cook has been with us for a decade. All are persons of unimpeachable character, Mr. Holmes. And on the evening of Mrs. Pembroke's death, all were present in the house? Yes, sir. Additionally, Mr. Edmund was in residence, having dined with his aunt that very evening. He seemed particularly agitated, I recall, and retired early to his chambers. Holmes ceased his pacing and moved to examine the letter once more through his magnifying lens. The handwriting is unquestionably authentic? You would stake your reputation upon it? Without hesitation, Mr. Holmes. I served as her amanuensis for 5 years and know every characteristic of her script. The tremor is consistent with her condition in her final days, but the formation of each letter is unmistakably hers. Then we are confronted with a mystery that transcends the merely criminal and enters the realm of the impossible, Holmes declared, his eyes gleaming with that cold fire I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases, A dead woman has described events that occurred after her death, posted a letter from beyond the grave, and provided us with specific clues to investigate. The blue vial, the shadow of the grandfather clock, and most significantly, the sound of a wardrobe being moved when she could not possibly have heard it. He turned to face us both, his expression grave. "Miss Whitmore, you were wise to seek my assistance, for I believe your life may indeed be in danger. However, you must return to Pembroke House immediately and behave as though nothing unusual has occurred. Speak of this visit to no one. Watson and I shall follow shortly, and we shall require access to examine both the blue vial and the area where the grandfather clock's shadow falls at noon." I retrieved my service revolver from the bureau, checking the mechanism with practiced efficiency. "What is your theory, Holmes?" "At present, Watson, I have 3 possibilities, each more extraordinary than the last. Either Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke is not truly dead, which seems unlikely given that Miss Whitmore attended her funeral, or she possessed supernatural foresight, which I reject on principle. Or we are the victims of an elaborate deception involving the manipulation of time itself. The answer lies within the walls of Pembroke House, and I suspect we shall need all our wits about us to catch a murderer who appears to have bent the very laws of nature to his purpose." As Miss Whitmore hurried down the stairs to secure transportation back to Kensington, Holmes stood by the fireplace, the mysterious letter still in his hands. "The game is afoot, Watson," he murmured. "But this time our adversary claims dominion over death itself. We shall see whether human cunning can indeed triumph over the natural order, or whether we face something far more sinister than mere mortal villainy." The hansom cab carried us through the fog-shrouded streets of Kensington, the yellow gaslight flickering through the mist like spectral beacons in the November gloom. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the passing lamps, his long fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against his knee. I had learned to recognize this particular mood as the prelude to his most concentrated reasoning, when his remarkable mind assembled and reassembled the scattered fragments of evidence into coherent, theoretical constructs. "The temporal impossibility remains the crux of our dilemma, Watson," he said at length, his voice low and thoughtful. "Mrs. Pembroke died on Sunday afternoon, yet describes hearing the wardrobe moved on Monday morning. Either she possessed supernatural foresight, which I categorically reject, or we are dealing with a deception of extraordinary sophistication. Yet why would a forger include a detail that immediately brands the letter as impossible? A skilled deceiver aims for credibility, not paradox." Before I could respond, our cab drew to a halt before an imposing Victorian residence of red brick and white stone, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching darkness. Miss Whitmore appeared at the front entrance before we had fully alighted, her face bearing an expression of mingled relief and fresh anxiety that immediately commanded Holmes's attention. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she whispered urgently, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Something dreadful has occurred since my return. Mr. Edmund has discovered that valuable items are missing from Mrs. Pembroke's private chambers. He has summoned the police and accused Mary, the housemaid, of theft. The poor girl swears her innocence, but Inspector Bradstreet is currently questioning the household staff." Holmes's eyebrows rose with interest. "Inspector Bradstreet? His presence may prove fortuitous. What items does Mr. Edmund claim are missing?" "A diamond brooch, several gold sovereigns, and most significantly, a small leather journal in which Mrs. Pembroke kept her private records. Mr. Edmund says he discovered the thefts when sorting through her effects this evening." "How remarkably convenient," Holmes murmured, "that these discoveries should occur on the very day you received our mysterious letter. The journal interests me particularly. Did your employer confide its contents to you? She was most private about her personal writings, though I know she made daily entries. The journal was kept locked in her escritoire, and the key hung from a chain about her neck. Before Holmes could respond further, the front door opened to reveal a tall, well-dressed man of perhaps 40 years, his features handsome but bearing the telltale signs of dissipation. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his movements possessed a nervous energy that spoke of barely controlled agitation. This was unmistakably Edmund Pembroke, and the calculating look he directed toward Holmes suggested he recognized the potential threat my friend represented. "Miss Whitmore," he said coldly, "I was not aware we were receiving callers. The house remains in mourning, and I gave specific instructions against visitors." Holmes stepped forward with that bland professional courtesy he employed when dealing with hostile subjects. "My apologies, Mr. Pembroke. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We were acquaintances of your late aunt through certain charitable correspondence. We came merely to pay our respects and offer condolences to Miss Whitmore, whom Mrs. Pembroke mentioned most fondly." Edmund's eyes narrowed with recognition and wariness. "I was unaware my aunt maintained such notable correspondences. Her affairs are entirely settled, Mr. Holmes. There is no need for your involvement here." "We shall trouble you only briefly," Holmes replied smoothly, his keen gaze already cataloguing details of the entrance hall. Miss Whitmore was about to show us where the dear lady passed. A sentimental request, I admit, but one I hope you will indulge. Edmund hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of refusal against allowing us to remain. Finally, with a dismissive gesture, he retreated toward the library. "Be quick about it. I have solicitors arriving shortly." As his footsteps faded, Holmes wasted no time. We ascended the broad staircase where an enormous grandfather clock dominated the first landing. Holmes paused before it, his eyes narrowing as he examined its position relative to the nearest window and the faint discoloration patterns on the wallpaper behind it. "The clock has been moved recently," he observed, kneeling to run his finger along the skirting board. "Perhaps only an inch or two, but moved nonetheless. Note the darker patch of wallpaper where it once stood, Watson. Someone has been manipulating shadows in this house." Miss Whitmore led us to Mrs. Pembroke's bedchamber, where Holmes immediately approached the medicine cabinet. Among the neatly arranged bottles stood a small blue glass vial, pushed slightly toward the back of the middle shelf. Holmes lifted it carefully with gloved hands, noting the sediment clinging to the glass and the faded label reading Tinct Digitalis in precise medical script. "Digitalis," I observed. "Commonly prescribed for cardiac conditions, but potentially lethal in excess." "Indeed, Watson. Yet this vial is nearly empty, though Miss Whitmore indicates it was opened only a fortnight ago." Holmes replaced the vial with careful precision, then moved to examine the window. The sash was closed, but unlatched, and when he raised it, the frame moved silently on well-oiled cords. He leaned out briefly, then withdrew, holding a small, crushed ivy leaf. "Freshly broken," he noted grimly. "Someone has used this window for entry or exit within recent days. Combined with the moved clock, the missing journal, and the convenient accusations of theft, we begin to see the outline of an elaborate deception." He turned to face us both, his expression grave. "We are not merely dealing with murder, Watson, but with something far more sophisticated. Someone has orchestrated events to create the illusion of communication from beyond the grave, while simultaneously eliminating evidence and deflecting suspicion. The question remains, who possessed both the knowledge to forge Mrs. Pembroke's hand so perfectly and the foresight to predict the wardrobe's movement? As we prepared to descend the stairs, Holmes paused once more beside the grandfather clock, his eyes fixed on the pattern of light filtering through the landing window. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun reaches its zenith, this clock's shadow will fall precisely where Mrs. Pembroke indicated. Whatever secret she sought to preserve lies waiting in that shadow, and I suspect it holds the key to unravelling this most singular mystery of a letter written after death. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, but this time our adversary had attempted to recruit death itself as an accomplice. Whether human cunning could triumph over such an audacious deception remained to be seen, but I had no doubt that my friend's relentless logic would ultimately prevail over even the most impossible circumstances. We had scarcely descended to the entrance hall when the authoritative voice of Inspector Bradstreet echoed through the corridors. The inspector stood with his notebook in hand, his solid frame filling the doorway as he questioned a trembling young housemaid who sat wringing her hands in obvious distress. His ruddy face brightened considerably upon recognizing Holmes, but despite their occasional differences in method, Bradstreet had learned to respect my friend's remarkable abilities. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed with genuine pleasure, "I had not expected to find you here, though I confess your presence may prove fortuitous. We appear to have a straightforward case of domestic theft, regrettable, though it is given the recent bereavement. Mr. Edmund Pembroke has made serious accusations against this young woman, Mary, claiming that valuable items have disappeared from his late aunt's chambers." Holmes approached the distraught girl with surprising gentleness, his keen eyes studying her face with that peculiar intensity that seemed to penetrate to the very soul. The maid looked up through reddened eyes, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. "I never touched nothing that wasn't mine, sir. Mrs. Pembroke was always kind to me, and I would sooner cut off my own hand than steal from her. I was only in her room to gather the linens for washing, just as Miss Whitmore instructed." "What specific items does Mr. Pembroke claim are missing, Inspector?" Holmes inquired, though his gaze remained fixed upon the trembling servant. "A diamond brooch worth perhaps £200, several gold sovereigns, and most significantly, a private journal in which Mrs. Pembroke kept her personal records. The escritoire shows clear signs of being forced with some sharp instrument. Mary here admits to having been in the room earlier today. Mr. Pembroke suggests she may have taken the key from Mrs. Pembroke's person before the funeral." Holmes's expression sharpened with interest. "When you were in Mrs. Pembroke's chamber today, Mary, did you notice anything unusual? Think carefully, for even the smallest detail may prove significant." The girl wiped her eyes with her apron, struggling to compose herself. "Well, sir, now that you mention it, the escritoire was already standing open when I entered, though Miss Whitmore had always told me it was kept locked. And there was a smell in the room, like someone had been smoking a cigar, though Mrs. Pembroke never allowed tobacco in her private chambers." "A cigar?" Holmes repeated, his eyebrows rising. "You are certain of this observation?" "Yes, sir. My father smokes them, so I know the smell well enough. It was faint, but definite." Holmes turned to Bradstreet with that expression of controlled excitement I had learned to recognize. "Inspector, I would strongly advise against arresting this young woman. The true thief, I believe, will reveal himself through more subtle means. However, I require your permission to conduct a brief examination of the household and the evidence in question." Bradstreet hesitated, glancing toward the library where Edmund Pembroke had retreated. "Mr. Pembroke is most insistent that immediate action be taken. He fears the girl may have accomplices and wishes to prevent any further losses." "Then let him believe his concerns are being addressed," Holmes replied quietly. "Post a constable at each entrance and ensure no one leaves the premises. Watson and I require perhaps an hour to complete our investigation. I believe you will find the results most illuminating." The inspector, recognizing the determined set of Holmes's jaw and recalling past successes, acquiesced with a grudging nod. Holmes immediately led us back upstairs to Mrs. Pembroke's sitting room, where the small writing desk stood with its drawers partially extended and papers in obvious disarray. He knelt beside the damaged lock, producing his magnifying lens to examine the scratches around the keyhole with methodical precision. "Observe these markings, Watson," he said, pointing to a series of fine parallel lines. "They suggest a thin, flat instrument, perhaps a letter opener or the blade of a narrow pocket knife. Note also the faint brass discoloration at the lower edge, indicating a tool with a brass bolster or handle fitting. Inspector, does Mary possess such an implement?" Bradstreet shook his head. "She does not, Mr. Holmes, but Mr. Pembroke mentioned that a small, gold-mounted pocket-knife of his own has gone missing from his chambers." "How remarkably convenient," Holmes murmured, rising to examine the window-sill where he drew his finger along the dusty surface, revealing 3 narrow tracks where some long object had recently been placed and removed. "Someone has used this window for entry or exit within recent days, and they brought with them an instrument capable of forcing that lock." We proceeded immediately to Edmund Pembroke's chambers on the 2nd floor, where Holmes's trained eye quickly catalogued the evidence of financial desperation. Racing forms lay scattered across the writing desk alongside correspondence from several gaming establishments, each letter increasingly urgent in tone. Most damning was a missive from a moneylender in Whitechapel demanding immediate payment of £300. "Our Mr. Edmund is in considerably deeper financial straits than Miss Whitmore suspected," Holmes observed, continuing his methodical search until he discovered a small bottle of India ink and several sheets of cream-coloured stationery identical to that used for Mrs. Pembroke's mysterious letter. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he held the paper up to the light, comparing the watermark to the original correspondence. "The paper is an exact match, Watson, and observe this cigar case recently used, the same Turkish tobacco whose aroma Mary detected in Mrs. Pembroke's chamber." He lifted the ink bottle, noting the faint lavender scent that emanated from within. "Our forger has been meticulous in his attention to detail, even scenting the paper to match his aunt's personal correspondence." "Then Edmund is our man?" I asked, but Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. "The evidence suggests forgery, certainly, but consider this paradox, Watson. The tremor in Mrs. Pembroke's script is perfectly consistent throughout the letter, suggesting genuine weakness in the hand that wrote it. A forger attempting to simulate such tremor invariably produces irregularities, moments where the hand steadies or where the simulation becomes too pronounced. This letter bears no such flaws. Either Edmund Pembroke is a forger of unprecedented skill, or the letter was indeed written by Mrs. Pembroke herself." "But that returns us to our original impossibility," I protested. "How could she describe events that occurred after her death?" "Unless," Holmes said slowly, his eyes distant with concentration, "the events were staged to match the letter, rather than the letter describing the events. Consider the sequence. Mrs. Pembroke dies, the letter is posted, the wardrobe is moved, the letter arrives. To the recipient, it appears as a message from beyond the grave, but to the orchestrator, it is merely a script being followed." We descended to the garden, where Holmes dropped to his knees in the damp earth beneath Mrs. Pembroke's window. The fog had begun to lift, allowing sufficient light for his examination of the ivy-covered wall. Within moments he had discovered a faint boot print in the soft soil, size 9 with a distinctive wear pattern on the outer heel. "Not a labourer's boot, but a gentleman's shoe of fine leather," he observed, then pointed to a small shred of black fabric caught in the ivy near the ground. Torn from a coat sleeve during a hasty descent, the intruder knew the house well enough to select the correct window, yet lacked the key to enter normally. This suggests someone familiar with the household's layout, but currently excluded from it. As we prepared to return to Baker Street, Holmes paused in the entrance hall, his expression grave. Inspector Bradstreet must maintain his watch throughout the night. I fear our murderer has not yet completed his work, and Miss Whitmore remains in considerable danger. The letter was meant as a warning, but it may also serve as a death warrant if our adversary realizes its true significance. The journey back to Baker Street was conducted in thoughtful silence. Upon our arrival, Holmes immediately dispatched a series of telegrams before settling into his armchair with his pipe, the smoke swirling around his head as he stared into the fire with that particular intensity that indicated his mind was wrestling with the final pieces of the puzzle. "The evidence points in multiple directions, Watson," he said finally. "Edmund has the motive, the means, and the opportunity for both murder and forgery. Yet the letter's impossible accuracy regarding future events suggests a more complex deception. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun reaches its zenith and the grandfather clock's shadow falls where Mrs. Pembroke indicated, we shall learn whether we face a ghost or a very clever living adversary who has attempted to bend the laws of nature to his murderous purpose." The night passed restlessly, filled with dreams of ticking clocks and moving shadows. When morning came, Holmes was already up, examining a street map of Kensington with intense concentration. His mood was brisk and purposeful, the brooding introspection of the previous evening replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter closing in on his prey. We breakfasted quickly and set out once more for Pembroke House, arriving shortly before 11 o'clock as pale shafts of winter sunlight began to pierce the lifting fog. Miss Whitmore met us at the door, her face bearing the strain of a sleepless night. "Mr. Edmund has been in the library all morning with his solicitors," she whispered. "They are finalizing the probate application. He seems triumphant, Mr. Holmes, as though he believes he has already won." "The game is not concluded until the final piece is played," Holmes replied softly, his eyes turning toward the staircase where the grandfather clock waited to reveal its secret. "The sun is approaching its zenith, Miss Whitmore, and the shadow of truth is about to fall precisely where your mistress intended. Whatever message she died to preserve, we shall know it within the hour." We positioned ourselves on the first landing as the hands of the grandfather clock crept inexorably toward the appointed hour. Holmes stood with his pocket watch extended, his keen eyes alternating between its face and the shifting pattern of sunlight that streamed through the tall window behind us. The pale November light cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor, and I could observe my friend calculating angles with the precision of an astronomer charting celestial movements. Miss Whitmore remained close beside us, her fingers nervously working the fabric of her black morning dress. The rhythmic ticking of the great clock seemed to grow more pronounced in the hushed atmosphere, each second marking our approach to whatever revelation Mrs. Pembroke had intended from beyond the grave. Below us, the muffled voices of Edmund Pembroke and his solicitors continued their legal discussions, unaware that their carefully laid plans might soon be overturned by a dead woman's foresight. Holmes had spent the previous minutes examining the landing with meticulous care, noting the faint discoloration on the wallpaper where the clock had recently been shifted and measuring the precise angles at which the winter sunlight would fall. His movements possessed that controlled intensity I had learned to associate with his most crucial deductions when every detail might prove significant to the resolution of a seemingly impossible mystery. "Observe the progression of the shadow, Watson," he murmured, gesturing toward the dark silhouette of the clock's case as it slowly lengthened across the floor. Mrs. Pembroke chose her moment with geometric precision. At exactly noon, when the sun reaches its zenith for this season, the shadow will point directly toward that section of wainscoting beneath the window seat. As the first chime of noon resonated through the house, the shadow of the grandfather clock fell precisely across a specific panel in the wooden wainscoting. Holmes dropped to his knees immediately, his long fingers probing the carved moulding with practiced efficiency. Within moments he had discovered a cunningly concealed mechanism, and a narrow panel swung inward to reveal a shallow cavity behind the woodwork. From this hiding place he withdrew 3 items with careful reverence: a leather-bound journal whose pages showed the unmistakable evidence of frequent use, a small iron key attached to a delicate chain, and a sealed envelope bearing the distinctive crest of Mrs. Pembroke's family seal pressed into red wax. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined each item, and when he finally looked up at us there was a mixture of admiration and sorrow in his grey eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, opening the journal to reveal pages filled with Mrs. Pembroke's distinctive handwriting, "your mistress was a woman of extraordinary courage and remarkable foresight. She knew she was being murdered, and she documented every suspicion, every strange occurrence, every alteration to her daily routine in these pages. More significantly, she recorded her growing certainty that Edmund intended to kill her before she could execute the changes to her will that would disinherit him entirely." Miss Whitmore gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the full implications became clear. Then she knew what he planned, but why did she not seek help from the authorities? Because she lacked the concrete proof that would convince a magistrate, and Edmund had been careful to establish his apparent legitimacy through Dr. Sterling's prescriptions and his position as her heir. She needed irrefutable evidence, and she sought to obtain it by feigning ignorance while secretly preparing for her own death. Holmes held up the sealed envelope. "This contains her new will, properly witnessed and executed just 3 days before her death. She hid it here, knowing that Edmund would search her chambers thoroughly after her demise. I examined the journal entries myself, noting the precise dates and meticulous observations. Mrs. Pembroke had chronicled her own murder with the methodical attention of a natural philosopher, recording symptoms that grew progressively worse after Edmund began personally overseeing her medication, noting the suspicious timing of Dr. Moore's retirement and Dr. Sterling's convenient arrival, and documenting her discovery of Edmund's mounting gambling debts and increasingly desperate financial situation. "But Holmes," I protested, "the letter she sent to Miss Whitmore described hearing the wardrobe being moved after her death. How could she have known such a specific detail would occur?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular satisfaction he reserved for the resolution of seemingly impossible puzzles. "Because, my dear Watson, she understood Edmund's mind well enough to predict his actions with mathematical precision. She knew that her death would necessitate moving the heavy wardrobe to allow the undertakers sufficient space to navigate the narrow staircase with her coffin. She had observed the same procedure when her husband died years earlier. It was not supernatural prophecy, but logical deduction based on practical necessity." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted our discussion. Edmund Pembroke appeared on the landing, his face flushed with annoyance, and his eyes darting suspiciously between our group and the open panel in the wainscoting. Behind him followed Inspector Bradstreet, whose expression suggested he had been summoned by our host's growing agitation. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Edmund demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "I will not have strangers ransacking my house and disturbing my aunt's final resting arrangements. Inspector, I insist you remove these people immediately." Holmes rose to his full height, the journal and sealed envelope held prominently in his hands. "Mr. Pembroke, these documents reveal the true circumstances of your aunt's death and expose the systematic campaign of murder you conducted against her. Inspector Bradstreet, I believe you will find the contents of this journal provide ample evidence for charges of deliberate poisoning." Edmund's composure shattered like glass struck by a hammer. his face drained of all colour, and his hands began to tremble as the full implications of the discovery became clear. "That journal proves nothing," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "The ravings of a sick old woman who imagined enemies everywhere. You cannot prove I harmed her in any way." "On the contrary," Holmes replied calmly, "your aunt documented every instance of your tampering with her medication, every forged signature on household accounts, every threatening conversation when she questioned your management of her affairs. She also recorded her decision to change her will entirely, leaving you with only a modest annuity while establishing a charitable foundation with the bulk of her estate." The sealed envelope crackled as Holmes held it up to the light. "This new will, properly witnessed by Messrs. Blackwood and Hart, supersedes entirely the document filed with Mr. Cartwright. You have murdered your aunt, Mr. Pembroke, only to discover that your crime has gained you nothing but a hangman's noose." Edmund's face contorted with rage and desperation. He lunged forward, not toward Holmes or the damning documents, but directly at Miss Whitmore, his hands extended like claws and his voice rising to a shriek of fury. "You poisoned her mind against me, you scheming little witch! This is all your doing!" Inspector Bradstreet and I moved simultaneously to intercept him, the inspector's strong arms pinning Edmund's wrists behind his back, while I positioned myself protectively before the terrified young woman. The violence of his attack had revealed the depths of his desperation and confirmed beyond any doubt the accuracy of his aunt's fears. "Edmund Pembroke," Bradstreet intoned with grim satisfaction, "I am arresting you for the attempted assault of Miss Whitmore and on suspicion of the willful murder of Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down in writing and may be used as evidence against you at your trial." As the constables led the struggling man away, still protesting his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Holmes turned to Miss Whitmore with an expression of profound respect and gentle sympathy. "Your mistress faced her death with extraordinary courage, Miss Whitmore. She transformed her final days into a methodical preparation for justice, ensuring that her murderer would not profit from his crime and that you would be protected from his vengeance." Miss Whitmore was weeping openly now, tears of grief and relief mingling on her pale cheeks. "She tried to warn me in so many subtle ways, Mr. Holmes. Little comments about being careful, about trusting my instincts, about ensuring certain letters were posted exactly as she instructed. I thought she was simply being protective, but she was preparing me for this moment." "She succeeded admirably in every particular," Holmes replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Her letter brought you to Baker Street at precisely the right moment. Her hidden evidence has provided us with irrefutable proof of Edmund's crimes, and her new will ensures that her wishes will be honoured despite his murderous intentions. The shadow of the grandfather clock has indeed revealed the truth, exactly as she intended." As we prepared to leave Pembroke House, Holmes paused on the threshold and looked back toward the grandfather clock standing silent on the landing. "A letter written after death," he murmured thoughtfully. "Not supernatural communication, Watson, but the logical calculations of a dying woman who understood her murderer's mind well enough to predict his every action. Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke reached from beyond the grave, not through mystical means, but through the power of reason, careful observation, and indomitable courage. It is a lesson in human dignity that we would all do well to remember." The fog had lifted entirely now, revealing a crisp afternoon sky that seemed to promise clearer days ahead. As our hansom cab carried us back toward Baker Street, I reflected on the remarkable woman who had orchestrated her own posthumous victory over the nephew who sought to profit from her death. In the end, Mrs. Pembroke had proven that even death could not defeat a mind armed with logic, foresight, and an unshakable determination to see justice done. The familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room provided little solace to Holmes as we settled before the dying fire, the events of the afternoon weighing heavily upon his mind. I observed him with growing concern as he sat motionless in his armchair, Mrs. Pembroke's leather journal resting unopened upon his knee, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The triumphant satisfaction that typically followed the resolution of a complex case was notably absent, replaced instead by an expression of profound unease that I had learned to associate with his most troubling discoveries. "You seem unusually contemplative, Holmes," I ventured, stirring the coals into a more vigorous blaze. "Surely the capture of Edmund Pembroke and the recovery of Mrs. Pembroke's evidence should bring you considerable satisfaction. The case appears resolved in every particular." Holmes lifted the journal with deliberate care, his long fingers tracing the worn leather binding as though seeking some hidden message within its texture. "That is precisely what disturbs me, Watson. When a mystery resolves itself too neatly, when every thread appears to tie itself into a perfect bow, I am invariably compelled to examine the pattern more closely. There are aspects of this affair that refuse to align themselves with the established facts, subtle inconsistencies that suggest we may have apprehended only the most visible portion of the conspiracy." He opened the journal to a page marked with his finger, his voice taking on that precise quality he employed when dissecting evidence. "Consider Mrs. Pembroke's treatment of Dr. Stirling. Throughout these entries, she documents every suspicious conversation with Edmund, every alteration to her daily routine, every symptom that worsened under the new medical regimen. Yet when she mentions Dr. Stirling directly, there is a curious restraint in her language. She notes that he was introduced by Edmund, that she mistrusted his manner, that her condition deteriorated under his care, but nowhere does she explicitly accuse him of deliberate malpractice or collusion. Perhaps she retained some professional respect for his medical credentials, I suggested, though even as I spoke, the explanation felt inadequate. "You misread her character entirely, Watson. This was a woman of remarkable intelligence and determination who suspected her own nephew of murder and took elaborate precautions to document his crimes. She would not have hesitated to name any accomplice once she had divined the truth. No, this omission is deliberate and significant. She feared to commit her suspicions about Dr. Stirling to writing, which suggests she believed he posed a more immediate and dangerous threat than Edmund himself." Before I could respond to this troubling observation, the familiar sound of heavy footsteps upon our stairs announced the arrival of Inspector Bradstreet. The inspector entered without ceremony, his ruddy features bearing an expression of considerable agitation that immediately commanded our attention. He declined the offered chair and instead paced before the fireplace, his notebook clutched in his hand like a talisman against uncertainty. "Mr. Holmes, I bring news that may complicate our understanding of the Pembroke affair," he began, his voice tight with professional concern. "The coroner has completed his more thorough examination of Mrs. Pembroke's remains, and the results are both illuminating and disturbing. The toxicological analysis reveals elevated concentrations of digitalis in her system, sufficient to have caused her death beyond any reasonable doubt. However, the distribution pattern suggests a gradual accumulation over at least a fortnight rather than a single fatal dose." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest, his earlier brooding replaced by focused attention. "So we have confirmation of systematic poisoning under the guise of legitimate medical treatment. That aligns perfectly with Mrs. Pembroke's documented suspicions about her deteriorating condition." "Indeed," Bradstreet continued, consulting his notes, "but there is more troubling news. When we attempted to locate Dr. Stirling, To obtain his medical records and prescription logs, we discovered that his surgery on Gloucester Road has been abandoned. The landlord reports that Sterling's belongings were removed hastily during the night following Edmund Pembroke's arrest. No forwarding address was provided, and inquiries at local lodging houses have thus far proven fruitless. Holmes rose from his chair with that fluid grace that always preceded his most intense periods of reasoning, his eyes already calculating the implications of this development. Our vanishing physician confirms my suspicions, Inspector. A man who flees at the first hint of investigation either possesses guilty knowledge or bears direct responsibility for the crimes in question. Dr. Sterling's disappearance transforms him from a potential witness into a probable accomplice. But surely his flight indicates panic rather than calculation, I protested. If he were truly guilty of conspiracy to murder, would he not have prepared a more sophisticated escape? On the contrary, Watson, his timing suggests careful preparation and advanced planning. Consider the sequence of events. Edmund is arrested, Sterling vanishes within hours, and we discover evidence of systematic poisoning that could only have been administered under medical supervision. This is not the panicked flight of an innocent man caught in unfortunate circumstances, but the calculated withdrawal of a conspirator whose role was always intended to remain hidden. Inspector Bradstreet nodded grimly. I have already issued warrants for his arrest and circulated his description to all railway stations and ports. However, I fear he may have had sufficient time to reach the coast and secure passage abroad. Holmes shook his head with quiet confidence, his fingers steepled before him in that characteristic gesture of deep concentration. Dr. Sterling will not flee to the continent, Inspector. Such a course would constitute an admission of guilt and would ensure he could never practice medicine again. No, he will seek to establish an alibi, to portray himself as an innocent physician who was deceived by a cunning patient. He requires time to construct his defense and will seek refuge somewhere his presence would excite no suspicion. Where would such a man hide? Bradstreet asked, his frustration evident. Consider his profession and the resources it provides, Holmes replied, moving to examine Mrs. Pembroke's journal once more. A physician possesses access to numerous institutions where his presence would be not merely accepted but welcomed. Hospitals, private sanatoriums, charitable clinics, any of these could provide temporary sanctuary while he monitors our investigation and gauges whether Edmund has implicated him directly. He paused at a specific page, his expression sharpening with recognition. Here, Watson, Mrs. Pembroke notes that Dr. Sterling mentioned accepting a consulting position at the Blackwood Sanatorium in Hampstead. She found it curious that he would take on additional responsibilities given his supposedly thriving private practice. I suspect this position was secured specifically to provide him with a secure location should circumstances require it. The implications were immediately clear to all of us. A sanatorium would offer Sterling complete freedom of movement, legitimate reasons for his presence, and access to medical supplies that might prove useful for further crimes. Moreover, the isolation and controlled environment would make it difficult for authorities to locate him without specific knowledge of his whereabouts. "Shall I dispatch constables immediately?" Bradstreet asked, his hand already moving toward his coat pocket where he kept his official whistle. "Not yet, Inspector," Holmes cautioned. "If we alert him to our knowledge of his location through a direct assault, he may escape once more, and this time we might not discover his destination so readily. I propose a more subtle approach that will allow us to confirm his presence and assess his state of mind before moving to apprehend him." Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of anticipation that always preceded our most dangerous undertakings. "Watson, your medical credentials will prove invaluable for our next gambit. We shall visit the Blackwood Sanatorium under the pretense of seeking treatment for a nervous condition. Once we have confirmed Sterling's presence and determined his level of suspicion, Inspector Bradstreet can move in with sufficient force to ensure his capture. Within the hour, we had secured transportation and were making our way through the fog-shrouded streets toward Hampstead, the weight of our service revolvers providing cold comfort against the unknown dangers that awaited us. Holmes had adopted the persona of a concerned friend accompanying a patient, while I prepared to play the role of a gentleman suffering from acute nervous exhaustion following traumatic experiences during my military service abroad. As our carriage navigated the increasingly narrow roads that led toward the sanatorium, Holmes reviewed the evidence once more, his sharp mind working to anticipate every possible complication. "We must proceed with extreme caution, Watson. A cornered man with medical knowledge represents an exceptionally dangerous adversary, particularly one who has already demonstrated his willingness to commit murder for financial gain. Dr. Sterling's flight confirms his guilt, but it also suggests he will not surrender without attempting some desperate measure to preserve his freedom." The Blackwood Sanatorium emerged from the evening mist like something from a Gothic novel. Its imposing Victorian architecture and barred windows presenting a forbidding aspect despite the carefully maintained grounds surrounding it. As we approached the main entrance, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap carefully prepared by our quarry, who had already proven himself capable of manipulating circumstances to his advantage with deadly efficiency. Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture of both camaraderie and warning. "The game enters its final phase, Watson. Dr. Sterling believes himself safely hidden, but he has merely chosen his own prison. Tonight we shall discover whether human cunning can indeed triumph over medical knowledge turned to murderous purpose, or whether we face an adversary whose desperation has made him more dangerous than we have yet imagined." The heavy oak doors of the Blackwood Sanatorium opened to reveal a world of muted gaslight and antiseptic efficiency. The matron who admitted us was a formidable woman whose starched uniform and jangling keys spoke of absolute authority over her domain. Her sharp eyes assessed my supposed condition with professional skepticism before softening marginally at Holmes's deferential explanation of our circumstances. The corridors beyond reeked of carbolic acid and boiled linens, while the distant murmur of voices and occasional metallic clink suggested the controlled routines of institutional life proceeding behind closed doors. "Dr. Sterling is currently conducting his evening consultations," the matron informed us, leading us to a sparsely furnished waiting room. "He maintains somewhat irregular hours owing to his private practice obligations, but I shall inform him of your arrival. Dr. Watson's condition appears to require immediate professional attention." Holmes adopted the manner of a concerned friend with consummate skill, expressing gratitude for the accommodation while his keen eyes catalogued every detail of our surroundings. Within a quarter hour, we were joined by the man whose flight from Gloucester Road had transformed him from potential witness to probable accomplice in murder. Dr. Sterling entered with the confident bearing of a successful physician, yet I observed immediately the subtle signs of strain that marked him as a man under considerable pressure. His handsome features bore the telltale marks of sleepless nights, and his eyes held that peculiar wariness of one who expects unwelcome visitors. When his gaze fell upon Holmes, I detected the faintest flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed but not entirely concealed. "Gentlemen," he began smoothly, settling into the chair opposite us with practiced ease, "I understand we have a case of nervous exhaustion requiring evaluation. Dr. Watson, is it not? The name strikes me as familiar, though I cannot immediately place the association." I launched into my prepared recitation of symptoms while observing Sterling's reactions with growing unease. His questions revealed genuine medical knowledge, yet there was something performative in his manner, as though he were following a script prepared for precisely this contingency. His fingers drummed nervously against his notebook, and I noticed the faint yellow staining that Holmes had taught me to associate with regular handling of certain chemical compounds. "Your condition appears manageable with proper rest and medication," Sterling concluded, closing his notebook with an air of professional finality. "I would recommend a course of mild sedatives to ensure proper sleep, perhaps combined with a regulated environment that minimizes external stimulation. The Blackwood Sanatorium maintains excellent facilities for such treatment." Holmes chose this moment to interject with deceptive casualness. "Dr. Sterling, I confess curiosity about your recent transition from private practice. What circumstances led you to abandon your surgery on Gloucester Road for institutional work? Surely the financial considerations would favor independent consultation." The change in Sterling's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders tensed and his grip tightened around the pencil he still held. "Professional advancement takes many forms, sir. The opportunity to work with a broader range of cases outweighed purely mercenary considerations." "You display remarkable knowledge of my circumstances," Holmes observed quietly, his grey eyes fixed upon Sterling with unwavering intensity. "Yet I have not introduced myself, nor has Dr. Watson mentioned my identity during our discussion of his condition. How do you come to know my name?" The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sterling's mask of professional composure cracked visibly, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. His hand moved instinctively toward his coat pocket before he checked the motion, recognizing the futility of whatever action he had contemplated. "You are Sherlock Holmes," Sterling said at length, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who has exhausted all alternatives. "Your reputation precedes you naturally. I should have anticipated that Mrs. Pembroke's death would eventually attract your attention." "As it should have attracted the attention of any competent physician," Holmes replied, his voice hard with controlled anger. "Yet instead of investigating the suspicious circumstances surrounding your patient's decline, you facilitated her murder through the systematic administration of digitalis in quantities far exceeding therapeutic necessity. Mrs. Pembroke documented your complicity in her own journal, Dr. Sterling. Your flight following Edmund Pembroke's arrest has merely confirmed what her written testimony already established." Sterling's composure shattered completely. He rose from his chair with sudden violence, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and desperation that transformed his refined features into something almost bestial. "You understand nothing of the pressures that drove me to this extremity," he snarled, backing toward the window behind his desk. "Edmund promised me £500 to ensure his aunt's death appeared natural, to sign the death certificate without arousing suspicion, £500 to secure my professional cooperation and my subsequent silence. And for that sum you betrayed your oath as a physician and participated in cold-blooded murder," Holmes replied, rising to match Sterling's movement while keeping himself between the doctor and the door. "Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke trusted you with her life, and you transformed that trust into an instrument of her destruction." Sterling laughed bitterly, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space. "Trust? She suspected me from the beginning, questioning every prescription, documenting every symptom in that accursed journal of hers. But Edmund assured me she had no proof, no means of exposing our arrangement. He was wrong about everything else as well. His debts exceeded £3,000, Mr. Holmes. The £500 he promised me was borrowed against an inheritance he would never have received, even if his aunt had died naturally. I destroyed my professional reputation and risked the gallows for a promise that was worthless from the moment it was made. Holmes stepped closer, his voice taking on an unexpected note of sympathy. "Then help us ensure that justice is served completely, Dr. Sterling. Edmund Pembroke has already been arrested, but without your testimony regarding the details of the conspiracy, he may yet escape the full consequences of his crimes. Your cooperation could demonstrate that you were manipulated by a more cunning mind." "You offer me the hangman's noose wrapped in the pretense of mercy," Sterling replied, his voice growing steadier even as his situation grew more desperate. "I'm not so foolish as to believe that testimony against Edmund will spare me from the consequences of murder. The law makes no distinction between the hand that plans and the hand that executes when both are equally guilty of taking human life." The confrontation had reached its crisis point, with Sterling cornered but not yet defeated, his medical knowledge providing him with resources for escape that few other criminals could command. The next few moments would determine whether justice would be served through the proper channels of law, or whether our quarry would attempt some desperate gambit to cheat both the hangman and his own conscience. Holmes stood poised like a spring ready to release, his entire being focused upon the dangerous man before us, who had proven himself capable of murder and might yet prove capable of far worse in his desperation to avoid the consequences of his crimes. Sterling's hand moved with practiced precision toward the leather medical bag that rested upon his desk, his fingers seeking among the familiar instruments and vials that had once been the tools of healing, but had become implements of murder. Holmes recognized the desperate intention immediately and stepped forward with measured caution, his keen eyes fixed upon every subtle movement of the cornered physician. "I would not recommend that course of action, Dr. Sterling," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had talked countless criminals back from the precipice of final desperation. "Whatever you contemplate will solve nothing and may well compound your difficulties beyond all hope of redemption." Sterling's fingers closed around a small blue vial identical to the one we had discovered in Mrs. Pembroke's medicine cabinet, his knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. "You speak of redemption, Mr. Holmes, but we both know that society offers no forgiveness for physicians who betray their sacred trust. The newspapers will make a sensation of my downfall, and the medical establishment will cast me out as a pariah. Death by my own hand carries more dignity than the public spectacle of trial and execution." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, moving closer with the fluid grace of a predator approaching wounded prey. "But consider this logical proposition, Dr. Sterling. Edmund Pembroke has already proven himself a master of deception and betrayal. What assurance do you possess that the vial you hold contains what he claimed when he provided it? A man who would murder his own aunt for financial gain would hardly scruple to eliminate his accomplice through treachery disguised as mercy." The words struck Sterling with visible force, and I observed the first flicker of doubt cross his features. His grip on the vial loosened slightly as the implications of Holmes's suggestion penetrated his despair. "He gave it to me personally," Sterling whispered, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "He said it contained concentrated digitalis, sufficient to ensure a swift and painless end should circumstances require it." "Then he armed you with the very poison that damned him," Holmes continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality I had observed during his most masterful interrogations. How convenient for Edmund that his accomplice should carry the means of his own destruction, ready to eliminate the one witness who could expose the full extent of his crimes. Ask yourself, Doctor, in all your dealings with Edmund Pembroke, did he ever demonstrate concern for anyone's welfare save his own? Sterling's composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. The vial trembled in his grasp as the full horror of his situation became clear. "He promised me £500, he said, his voice breaking, with the weight of his confession. £500 to ensure his aunt's death appeared natural, to sign the certificate without arousing suspicion. But his debts exceeded 3,000, Mr. Holmes. The money he offered was borrowed against an inheritance he would never have received, even if she had died naturally. I destroyed my career and risked my life for a promise that was worthless from the moment it was made. Holmes reached out slowly and gently removed the vial from Sterling's nerveless fingers, passing it to me for safekeeping. Your realization comes late, Dr. Sterling, but it is not too late to serve some purpose beyond Edmund's schemes. Mrs. Pembroke documented her suspicions with remarkable precision, but your testimony could ensure that justice is served completely and that Edmund faces the full consequences of his manipulation. The fight seemed to drain from Sterling entirely as he collapsed into his chair, his hands shaking violently as the magnitude of his situation overwhelmed him. I administered the final dose on Sunday morning, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mixed into her morning tea just as Edmund demanded. She questioned the necessity of the increased medication, but I assured her it was merely a precautionary measure given her advancing age. She trusted me, Mr. Holmes. She placed her life in my hands, and I used that trust to murder her. The door opened at that moment to admit Inspector Bradstreet and 2 uniformed constables, their timing coordinated with the precision Holmes always brought to such operations. The inspector's weathered face bore an expression of grim satisfaction as he surveyed the scene, taking in Sterling's defeated posture and the confession that hung in the air like an indictment. Dr. Sterling, Bradstreet intoned with formal gravity, I am placing you under arrest for the willful murder of Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke and conspiracy to defraud her estate. You will be taken to Scotland Yard for formal charging and will appear before the magistrate tomorrow morning. As the constables moved to secure Sterling with iron manacles, Holmes retrieved Mrs. Pembroke's journal from his coat and placed it deliberately upon the desk. Your confession confirms what she documented with such meticulous care, Dr. Sterling. In death, she has proven herself a more formidable adversary than you ever imagined during life. The letter written after death was not supernatural communication, but the logical culmination of a dying woman's determination to see justice served. Sterling's eyes fell upon the journal with something approaching reverence. She defeated us both, didn't she? Edmund with his greed and me with my cowardice. We thought ourselves clever conspirators, but we were merely predictable villains following a script she had already written in her mind. As the constables led Sterling toward the waiting police van, his shoulders bowed with the weight of his crimes and his fate, Holmes turned to me with an expression that mingled satisfaction with profound sadness. The case concludes as, "It must, Watson, with justice served and villains apprehended. Yet I confess a lingering melancholy at the waste of human potential. Sterling possessed genuine medical skill that might have saved countless lives had he chosen honor over avarice." The fog had begun to lift as we emerged from the sanatorium, revealing stars that glittered like diamonds against the velvet darkness. Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke's letter had indeed been written after death, but through the power of human reason and indomitable will rather than supernatural intervention. Her victory over those who sought to profit from her murder was complete, achieved through careful planning and an understanding of human nature that transcended even the grave itself. The police van disappeared into the fog-shrouded streets of Hampstead, carrying Dr. Sterling toward his inevitable appointment with justice. Holmes stood in contemplative silence beside the entrance to the Blackwood Sanatorium, his keen eyes following the vehicle's retreat until its lamps vanished entirely into the November mist. The weight of the completed investigation seemed to settle upon his shoulders, bringing with it both satisfaction and, a peculiar melancholy that I had learned to associate with his most profound cases. "The final piece falls into place, Watson," he said quietly, as we settled into our waiting hansom for the journey back to Baker Street. "Edmund Pembroke and Dr. Sterling will face trial within the month, and I have little doubt that both will answer for their crimes with their lives. Yet I confess a lingering fascination with the extraordinary mind that orchestrated their downfall from beyond the grave." The rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones provided a soothing counterpoint to his reflections as we made our way through the darkened streets of London. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before continuing his analysis with that precision I had come to expect when he dissected the mechanics of a particularly complex case. "Consider the remarkable intelligence required to predict human behavior with such mathematical accuracy, Watson." Mrs. Pembroke understood that Edmund's greed would make him retain Sterling's services through promises he could never fulfill, just as she knew Sterling's cowardice would make him vulnerable once pressure was applied. She orchestrated their mutual destruction with the skill of a chess master, positioning pieces for an inevitable checkmate. Her courage was equally extraordinary, I observed, recalling the meticulous journal entries that had documented her own murder with scientific detachment. To live with the knowledge that one is being systematically poisoned, yet maintain the facade of ignorance while gathering evidence, it requires strength of character few possess. Indeed, Watson, and observe the elegant psychology of her final stratagem. A simple posthumous letter accusing Edmund might have been dismissed as the wanderings of a dying mind, particularly with a physician ready to testify to her mental decline. But a letter describing events that occurred after her death, that paradox demanded investigation by any curious mind. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the mysterious letter that had initiated our involvement, examining it once more in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows. She calculated every variable with scientific precision. The wardrobe would require moving because the staircase was narrow and the coffin would be wide. The shadow of the grandfather clock would fall at the appointed spot because the laws of physics are immutable. Miss Whitmore would seek my assistance because she had instilled in her companion a respect for logic and justice. Our arrival at Baker Street coincided with that of another visitor. Miss Whitmore stood waiting beneath the gaslight, her appearance transformed from the terrified young woman who had first sought our help. Though still dressed in mourning, her bearing possessed a new confidence, and her eyes shone with gratitude as she followed us up the familiar stairs to our sitting room. "The solicitors have confirmed everything, Mr. Holmes," she said, accepting the chair he offered with graceful composure. "Mrs. Pembroke's new will has been validated, and the charitable foundation she envisioned will be established with the bulk of her estate. She left me a generous annuity, far more than I expected, along with a personal letter urging me to pursue my own education and independence." "She recognized in you a kindred spirit, Miss Whitmore," Holmes replied gently, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. "Someone capable of observation, loyalty, and moral courage, qualities she valued above all else. You served her admirably in life, and by bringing her letter to me, you ensured her triumph in death." Holmes moved to the fireplace, where the flames cast dancing shadows across his sharp features. "Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke has proven that the human mind remains formidable even when the body fails, and that truth, once documented and preserved, possesses a power that transcends death itself. She defeated her murderers not through supernatural intervention, but through superior intelligence, careful planning, and an unshakable determination to see justice served." As Miss Whitmore took her leave with heartfelt thanks, I reflected on the remarkable resolution of our most unusual case. The letter written after death had indeed been impossible for anyone except a woman whose understanding of human nature and scientific principle allowed her to orchestrate events from beyond the grave. Mrs. Pembroke's posthumous victory stood as testament to the triumph of reason over greed, of foresight over brutality, and of justice over the machinations of those who believed death would silence their victim forever. Holmes settled into his armchair with his pipe, the smoke curling upward as he gazed into the fire with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of his most challenging investigations. "The game is concluded, Watson," he murmured, "and once again we find that the greatest mysteries yield to the application of logic, observation, and unwavering persistence in the pursuit of truth." The weeks that followed brought the inevitable machinery of justice into motion with relentless precision. The trial of Edmund Pembroke and Dr. Stirling at the Old Bailey became the sensation of the season, drawing crowds who queued in the bitter December cold for the privilege of witnessing the prosecution of men who had attempted to murder their way to fortune. Holmes and I attended each day of the proceedings, observing as the Crown methodically presented the damning evidence we had uncovered. The courtroom fell into profound silence as Mrs. Pembroke's journal was read aloud, her precise documentation of symptoms and suspicions creating an unassailable portrait of systematic poisoning. Edmund maintained his innocence with desperate defiance, but his defense crumbled entirely when Dr. Stirling, seeking some measure of clemency through cooperation, provided detailed testimony regarding their conspiracy. The physician described how Edmund had approached him with the murderous proposition, offering £500 to ensure his aunt's death appeared natural through the gradual administration of fatal doses of digitalis. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented the mysterious letter that had initiated our investigation. The Crown's expert testified to its authenticity, confirming that every word had flowed from Mrs. Pembroke's own pen. The jury listened with rapt fascination as the prosecutor explained how the deceased woman had predicted future events not through supernatural means, but through logical deduction based on practical necessity and her profound understanding of human nature. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning, with guilty verdict for both defendants. The judge's sentencing was swift and merciless, condemning both men to death by hanging for the willful murder of Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke. Edmund collapsed as the sentence was pronounced, while Stirling accepted his fate with the hollow resignation of a man who had long abandoned hope. As we departed into the pale winter afternoon, Holmes paused on the courthouse steps, his grey eyes thoughtful as he gazed across the bustling thoroughfare. "There is a profound lesson in this affair, Watson," he observed quietly. "Edmund Pembroke believed himself a master of calculation, yet his entire scheme was predicated on the fatal assumption that his victim was merely a passive object to be removed, rather than an active intelligence capable of superior strategy. She transformed her own death into a weapon against her murderers," I reflected, still awed by the extraordinary woman's courage and foresight. Precisely, Mrs. Pembroke understood that true victory lies not in avoiding death, which comes to us all, but in ensuring that one's principles survive beyond the grave. She refused to be merely a victim and instead became the architect of justice itself. Holmes smiled with genuine admiration. "Give me facts, however strange, Watson, and I will show you they fall within the compass of natural law. The true marvel lies always in the power of the human intellect when armed with courage and unshakable conviction. Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke has proven that even death cannot defeat a mind determined to see truth prevail." The fog began to lift as we walked toward Baker Street, carrying with it the memory of a woman who had reached back from the silence of the grave to ensure that justice was served. The case was closed, but its lesson would endure. That reason, properly applied, remains humanity's greatest weapon against the forces of greed and corruption. The fire had settled into glowing embers by the time Holmes finally closed Mrs. Pembroke's journal, its pages now bearing the faint impressions of his careful study. The familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room seemed particularly welcome after the grim proceedings at the Old Bailey, where justice had been served with the mechanical precision that characterized our legal system. I had been organizing my notes for the narrative that would eventually chronicle this most unusual case when Holmes broke the contemplative silence that had settled between us like a comfortable blanket. The case concludes as all cases must, Watson, with the guilty receiving their due punishment and the innocent vindicated, yet I confess myself profoundly moved by the extraordinary woman who orchestrated this outcome from beyond the grave. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded streets where gaslight flickered through the November mist. Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke faced her own murder with the detached precision of a natural philosopher conducting a crucial experiment, documenting variables and predicting outcomes with mathematical accuracy. Her courage was remarkable, I observed, still awed by the meticulous journal entries that had recorded her systematic poisoning with scientific objectivity. To live with the knowledge that one's own nephew was orchestrating one's death, yet maintain the facade of ignorance while gathering irrefutable evidence, it requires a strength of character few possess. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his long fingers drumming against the window frame in that characteristic rhythm I had learned to associate with his deepest contemplations. She understood something that escaped both Edmund and Sterling entirely, Watson. They believed murder was merely the physical act of ending a life, but Mrs. Pembroke recognized that true victory lies not in avoiding death, which comes to us all, but in ensuring that one's principles survive beyond the grave. The letter written after death, I mused, was her masterstroke, not supernatural communication, but the logical culmination of superior intelligence applied to the problem of posthumous justice. Precisely, she transformed an apparent impossibility into an elegant demonstration of cause and effect. The wardrobe would require moving because the staircase was narrow and the coffin would be wide. The shadow would fall at the appointed spot because the laws of physics are immutable. Miss Whitmore would seek my assistance because she had instilled in her companion a respect for logic and justice. Holmes smiled with genuine admiration. Every element was calculated with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for an inevitable checkmate. The familiar sound of hooves on cobblestones drifted up from the street below, suggesting that London's endless parade of human drama continued unabated. Holmes returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe with the satisfied air of a man who had witnessed the triumph of reason over greed. "Will you take another case soon?" I asked, recognizing the restless energy that always preceded his periods of intense intellectual activity. "Perhaps, Watson, though I suspect nothing will match the singular elegance of Mrs. Pembroke's posthumous stratagem for some time. She has demonstrated that the human mind, properly applied, remains formidable even when the body fails." He lit his pipe, sending aromatic smoke curling toward the ceiling. "But London is vast, human nature remains constant, and crime continues to provide puzzles worthy of our attention. When the next impossibility presents itself, we shall apply the same principles that served us here: observation, logic, and the unwavering conviction that truth, however strange it may appear, must ultimately conform to natural law." As I prepared my final notes on the case of the letter written after death, I reflected that Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke had achieved something far more significant than mere revenge against her murderers. She had proven that justice, like truth itself, possesses a power that transcends even death when guided by superior intelligence and unwavering moral courage.